What if the city you dreamed of visiting was quietly testing your limits the moment you arrived? New York is sold as a symbol of freedom, ambition, and limitless opportunity. But beneath that polished image exists a reality most people are never prepared for. The myth of New York is powerful precisely because it hides in plain sight. Movies, social media, and urban marketing teach us to see glamour, energy, and success. What they don't show is how quickly that illusion fractures once you step outside the curated experience. This city was never designed for comfort. It was designed for pressure. From the first moment a visitor enters New York, there is an unspoken tension in the air. The crowds move fast, not because they are productive, but because standing still feels unsafe. Noise never truly fades. Sirens, engines, voices, and construction blend into a constant sensory overload that slowly erodes attention and emotional stability. This isn't chaos by accident. It is a system that normalizes stress as the price of being here. The danger isn't always obvious. It doesn't announce itself with flashing signs or dramatic moments. It hides in the gaps between places people photograph. Transitional zones, corridors, stations, streets that exist only to move bodies efficiently, not to protect them. These are the areas where the city's social fabric is thinnest, where exhaustion meets neglect, and where visitors suddenly feel watched, rushed, or exposed without understanding why. What makes New York different from other cities in decline is denial. The city's identity depends on maintaining the idea that everything here is exceptional. Admitting structural decay threatens the myth that fuels tourism, investment, and status. So the uncomfortable truths are reframed as urban character, grit, or simply ignored. Visitors are told to be alert, but never told why. Locals adapt, not because conditions improve, but because resignation becomes survival. There is a psychological cost to this environment that statistics never capture. Hypervigilance becomes routine. Empathy contracts. People learn to look away, to keep moving, to avoid engagement. Over time, the city teaches both residents and visitors the same lesson. Trust less, rush more, feel later. This is not an isolated failure of a few neighborhoods. It is the early signal of a broader urban breakdown that expresses itself first where people are most transient and least protected. And once you start noticing these patterns, the question becomes unavoidable. If this is what exists just beneath the surface of the world's most celebrated city, what else are we being trained not to see? If this perspective already feels uncomfortable, that reaction matters. Understanding what really happens beneath the surface of cities like New York is not about fear. It is about awareness. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most so far, or write, "I see it now," if this matches something you've felt but never heard explained. Liking this video and subscribing helps keep this kind of honest urban analysis alive, because these conversations rarely happen in mainstream narratives. There is a reason silence surrounds the most uncomfortable parts of New York. It is not because people do not see them. It is because speaking openly threatens the machinery that keeps the city functioning as a global product. Tourism depends on controlled narratives. Real estate depends on perception. Status depends on illusion. So entire zones of experience are quietly excluded from the official story, even though they shape daily life far more than landmarks ever could. What visitors rarely realize is how much effort goes into guiding their movement. Hotels cluster tourists into predictable corridors. Advertising funnels attention toward a handful of streets, views, and attractions. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, completely different realities unfold. These are not secret places. They are simply inconvenient ones. Areas where infrastructure strains, social services fail, and human distress becomes impossible to aestheticize. The silence around them is strategic. This silence creates a dangerous mismatch between expectation and reality. Visitors arrive believing New York is intense but manageable, chaotic but safe, rough but rewarding. Then something feels off. A subway platform where tension hangs too thick, an airport terminal where exhaustion turns into aggression, a street where people move past each other without acknowledgement, as if everyone has learned to conserve emotional energy. None of this fits the narrative they were sold, so they assume the problem is personal, not structural. Here is the uncomfortable insight most people miss. Silence is not neutral. It trains behavior. When issues are never openly discussed, individuals internalize responsibility. If you feel unsafe, you blame your awareness. If you feel overwhelmed, you assume weakness. If something goes wrong, you think you made a mistake by being there. This is how systemic problems remain invisible while repeating daily. Every large city has difficult areas. What sets New York apart is how normalized avoidance has become. Residents learn routes not based on distance, but on psychological cost. Certain stations, passages, and blocks are avoided not because of crime statistics, but because of lived experience. Tourists are never taught this map. They are only told that New York is tough, without being told where that toughness concentrates or why. The human cost of this silence shows up subtly. People stop asking questions. They stop expecting improvement. They stop believing acknowledgement will lead to change. Over time, silence becomes culture, and culture shapes cities more powerfully than policy ever could. New York is often described as a city that never sleeps, but the truth is far more unsettling. It is a city that never allows its nervous system to rest. Constant movement is not energy here, it is defense. People walk fast because slowing down feels risky. They avoid eye contact not out of rudeness, but out of learned caution. Over time, this creates an environment where stress is no longer a reaction, it is the baseline. For visitors, this pressure appears subtle at first. The noise feels exciting. The crowds feel alive. The density feels like opportunity. But after hours, sometimes minutes, the body starts responding differently. Shoulders tense. Breathing shortens. Attention fragments. The mind stays alert even when there is no clear threat. This is not imagination. It is the psychological effect of constant stimulation combined with low-trust environments. The city quietly trains hypervigilance. Sirens become background noise, but they still trigger micro-stress responses. Subway delays create irritation not because of inconvenience, but because unpredictability erodes the sense of control. Airports feel less like gateways and more like pressure chambers where exhaustion, confusion, and impatience collide. These spaces are not dangerous in a dramatic sense. They are dangerous because they drain people mentally until mistakes become more likely. Here is the twist most people miss. Chronic stress changes how cities function socially. When everyone is overwhelmed, empathy collapses. Small conflicts escalate faster. People intervene less. The social contract weakens, not because people are bad, but because they are depleted. This is how environments become hostile without becoming openly violent. The threat is ambient, not explosive. Residents adapt by narrowing their emotional bandwidth. They learn which stations to avoid at certain hours, which streets feel unpredictable, which moments require emotional armor. Visitors do not have this learned map. They walk into the city expecting stimulation, not sustained psychological pressure. When discomfort appears, they rarely connect it to the environment. They blame fatigue, jet lag, or bad luck. Over time, the city normalizes this state. Being tense becomes responsible. Being alert becomes smart. Being disconnected becomes efficient. But what happens when an entire urban system operates under constant psychological strain? The answer is not immediate collapse. It is slow erosion. Mistakes increase. Trust decreases. Fear becomes routine without being named. There are parts of New York most visitors pass through without ever really seeing them. They are not landmarks, not destinations, not places meant to be remembered. They exist between moments, transit corridors, transfer stations, underpasses, terminal edges. These spaces are where the city stops performing and starts revealing itself. And they are often where the first real sense of threat appears. These zones were designed for efficiency, not safety or dignity. Their purpose is movement, not presence. People are meant to pass through quickly, without stopping, without asking questions. Lighting is functional, Signage is minimal, surveillance is inconsistent. The atmosphere feels unfinished, almost temporary, yet millions of people depend on these spaces every day. When systems are under strain, these are the areas that absorb the pressure first. For a visitor, the discomfort is hard to name. Nothing dramatic is happening, yet something feels wrong. The crowd behaves differently. People cluster, then suddenly scatter. There is less eye contact, less predictability. You may notice individuals sleeping, arguing, pacing, or shouting, not as isolated incidents but as part of the background. This is where social breakdown becomes visible, not through crime, but through neglect. The insight most people miss is that these spaces are not anomalies. They are diagnostic tools. When a city is healthy, transitional zones feel neutral. When a city is stressed, they become hostile. Maintenance declines. Policing becomes reactive instead of preventive. Social services retreat. What remains is a thin layer of order stretched over unresolved human distress. These areas also expose the hierarchy of protection. Tourists are protected where they are expected to spend money. Residents with resources avoid these corridors when they can. Everyone else is funneled through them. This is how inequality becomes spatial, not just economic. The city quietly decides who deserves comfort and who must endure friction as part of daily life. Airports and major stations amplify this effect. They concentrate exhaustion, confusion, language barriers, and time pressure into enclosed environments. When systems fail, delays ripple outward emotionally. Frustration escalates faster. Authority feels distant. And visitors, unfamiliar with local cues, become especially vulnerable to misjudging situations. Again, not because the city is inherently violent, but because it is overstretched. These invisible zones tell a story official narratives avoid. They show how close the eye system operates to its limits. They reveal how much normal life depends on people enduring discomfort without complaint. And once you learn to see them, you realize they exist in every major city following the same path. Infrastructure is supposed to be invisible when it works. In New York, it is impossible to ignore because it is constantly asking people to compensate for its failures. Airports that feel permanently overloaded. Subway systems where delays are treated as normal rather than exceptional. Stations patched instead of repaired. Elevators that work just often enough to avoid outrage. These are not isolated maintenance issues. They are signals of a system operating beyond sustainable capacity. For visitors, infrastructure stress shows up as confusion and fatigue. Long security lines that move unpredictably. Terminals designed decades ago now absorbing volumes they were never meant to handle. Announcements that contradict each other. Screens that lag behind reality. Every small friction increases cognitive load. By the time people leave the airport or subway, they're already mentally depleted, less attentive, more reactive. That is when mistakes happen. The deeper issue is not age, but prioritization. New York invests heavily in what is visible and profitable. Facades get refreshed, tourist zones get upgraded. But connective systems, the ones that serve everyone equally, receive incremental fixes instead of structural solutions. This creates a city that looks functional while quietly eroding at its joints. The more pressure increases, the more fragile those joints become. Here is the twist most people do not expect. Infrastructure stress reshapes behavior. When systems are unreliable, people stop planning and start improvising. They rush, they push, they cut corners. Courtesy becomes inefficient. Over time, this changes social norms. Aggression rises not because people want conflict, but because patience becomes a liability. Visitors often interpret this as rudeness. In reality, it is adaptation to chronic system failure. Subway platforms illustrate this perfectly. When schedules mean little, crowds surge unpredictably. People position themselves defensively. Space becomes contested. The environment teaches micro-competition. Airports mirror this dynamic on a larger scale. When delays cascade, authority loses credibility. Rules feel arbitrary. People test boundaries. Stress spreads socially, moving faster than any announcement. What makes this dangerous is normalization. When breakdown becomes routine, warning signs lose power. Visitors are told to expect delays without understanding that delays are symptoms, not causes. They are experiencing the surface effects of decades of deferred investment, political avoidance, and economic extraction layered onto aging systems. Once you recognize infrastructure as a psychological force, not just a technical one, the picture shifts. These systems are shaping how people feel, move, and interact. And when they strain, the city's ability to protect, guide, and stabilize its population weakens quietly. At some point, chaos stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like background noise. That is one of the most dangerous transitions a city can make. In New York, this shift has already happened. Situations that would once trigger alarm are now absorbed into routine. People step over disturbances, not because they are cruel, but because reacting to everything would make daily life impossible. You see it in small moments that accumulate into something larger. Public arguments that draw no attention. People screaming into the air while commuters keep walking. Security incidents treated as inconveniences. Delays explained away with shrugs. The city teaches its population a silent rule: acknowledge nothing unless it directly blocks your path. This is how abnormal conditions become normalized without ever being solved. For visitors, this creates a confusing emotional landscape. They sense tension, but no one else seems to respond. That disconnect is unsettling. When a space feels unsafe but everyone around you behaves as if it is ordinary, your instincts hesitate. Should you react, or are you overreacting? This hesitation is not accidental. It is the product of a social environment trained to suppress signals of distress to keep moving. The deeper problem is what normalization does to collective responsibility. When chaos is expected, accountability dissolves. Failures are reframed as features of urban life. Complaints are dismissed as naivete. Over time, this erodes the idea that cities should protect their inhabitants emotionally as well as physically. Survival replaces well-being as the baseline expectation. There is a psychological mechanism at work here. Repeated exposure without resolution leads to emotional numbing. The brain conserves energy by lowering sensitivity. This helps individuals cope in the short term, but it weakens social bonds in the long term. People intervene less. Trust declines. Shared space feels less shared. The city becomes crowded but lonely, intense but disconnected. What makes this especially concerning is how it feeds back into infrastructure and policy. When residents stop expecting better, pressure for improvement fades. When visitors are told this is just how New York is, the city's reputation absorbs the damage instead of addressing the cause. Normalization becomes a shield against reform. This is not collapse as explosion. It is collapse as erosion, a slow wearing down of standards, reactions, and expectations. And once this process sets in, reversing it becomes exponentially harder because the first casualty is belief that change is possible. There is no siren when people are pushed out of a city, no breaking news alert, no visible moment of collapse. In New York, expulsion happens quietly, through pressure rather than force. Rent rises faster than wages. Basic services become luxuries. Commutes stretch longer while living spaces shrink. The city does not tell people to leave. It simply makes staying unbearable. This is what makes the process so effective. Gentrification is often framed as renewal, but for many residents it feels more like erosion. Neighborhoods do not disappear overnight. They hollow out. Familiar faces vanish one by one. Local businesses close, replaced by chains that serve visitors rather than communities. Cultural anchors fade, and what remains looks polished but feels empty. The city grows richer on paper while becoming less livable in reality. The psychological toll of this pressure is rarely discussed. Living under constant financial strain rewires decision-making. People stop planning long-term. They delay healthcare, relationships, rest. Every choice becomes transactional. Visitors may see vibrant streets, but residents experience them as hostile terrain where one misstep can trigger displacement. Stability becomes fragile, conditional, temporary. Here is the unsettling insight. Expulsion does not only affect those who leave, it reshapes the city itself. When long-term residents disappear, social memory disappears with them. Informal safety nets weaken. Trust between neighbors dissolves. What replaces it is a transient population with little incentive to invest emotionally in shared space. The city becomes a stage set, not a home. For visitors, this creates a strange contradiction. New York feels busy but strangely detached. People are everywhere, yet few seem rooted. Interactions are efficient but shallow. There is movement without belonging. This is not accidental. It is the outcome of a city optimized for extraction rather than habitation. The most dangerous aspect of silent expulsion is how normalized it has become. Leaving is framed as a personal failure rather than a systemic outcome. Those who remain are praised for resilience, as if endurance were success. Meanwhile, the conditions driving people out continue unchallenged, protected by narratives of growth and progress. Once a city crosses this threshold, recovery becomes difficult. You cannot rebuild community quickly. You cannot replace lived history with branding. And you cannot sustain safety in a place where people feel temporary by design. For many visitors, the most unsettling part of New York is not a single incident, but a growing sense of disorientation. The city promises intensity and delivers overload. Streets feel crowded yet impersonal. Encounters are frequent but fleeting. Help exists everywhere in theory, yet feels distant in practice. This gap between expectation and experience creates a quiet vulnerability most people struggle to articulate. Visitors arrive believing the city will guide them. Signs, systems, crowds, and routines are assumed to provide structure. But New York increasingly demands interpretation rather than offering clarity. Directions contradict reality. Rules feel situational. What works in one neighborhood fails in another. For someone unfamiliar with these invisible codes, small mistakes multiply. A wrong turn becomes stress. A missed train becomes anxiety. Confusion accumulates faster than confidence. The emotional impact is subtle but powerful. When people feel unsure, they second-guess their instincts. They hesitate. They rely on crowds rather than judgment. This is where risk increases. Not because the city is full of threats, but because uncertainty erodes awareness. The brain shifts from observation to self-regulation, leaving less capacity to read environments accurately. Here is the overlooked insight. Cities under strain stop educating newcomers. Instead of welcoming, they test. Locals have learned shortcuts, timing, and avoidance patterns through years of exposure. Visitors do not have that knowledge, yet are expected to behave as if they do. When discomfort appears, it is dismissed as inexperience rather than recognized, as a signal of systemic friction. This mismatch is especially visible in transit-heavy areas, stations where signage assumes familiarity, platforms where announcements are vague or delayed, crowds that surge without warning. In these moments, visitors are not protected by systems, they are absorbed into them. And systems under pressure do not adapt to individuals, they demand compliance. What breaks the promise of a welcoming city is not hostility, but indifference. People are too busy coping to assist. Authority figures are focused on control rather than guidance. The result is a city that functions, but does not care if you understand how. For short stays, this feels exhausting. For longer ones, it becomes alienating. This experience forces an uncomfortable question. If a city cannot orient those passing through, how well can it support those trying to build a life within it? The visitor's confusion is not an exception. It is a compressed version of what residents experience, daily, stretched over years instead of days. There is an unspoken agreement holding New York together, and it depends on denial. Not denial in the sense of ignorance, but denial as maintenance. Admitting the depth of structural decline would force uncomfortable questions about who the city is really built for and who it is willing to sacrifice to keep functioning. So problems are reframed, softened, or absorbed into the city's identity, as if inevitability were destiny. Institutional language plays a critical role here. Decline becomes transition. Overcrowding becomes vibrancy. Exhaustion becomes ambition. When systems fail, explanations focus on temporary strain rather than long-term neglect. This language is not accidental. It protects the image that keeps money, tourists, and talent flowing in. A city that openly acknowledges dysfunction risks losing its symbolic power, and New York survives on symbolism as much as on infrastructure. Cultural denial reinforces this pattern. Media narratives celebrate resilience without questioning why resilience is required in the first place. Stories focus on individual success against the odds, not on the odds themselves. This frames hardship as a test of character rather than evidence of systemic failure. If someone struggles, the implication is that they did not adapt well enough, not that the environment is unsustainable. For residents, denial becomes a coping strategy. Acknowledging how difficult daily life has become would mean confronting loss, anger, and uncertainty. It is easier to normalize stress than to name it. Conversations shift toward humor, irony, or detachment. Complaints are softened into jokes. Serious concerns are dismissed as exaggeration. Over time, this erodes the language needed to demand change. Visitors sense this contradiction instinctively. They hear confidence, but feel tension. They are told the city is safe, exciting, unmatched, yet experience moments that do not align with that promise. When they ask questions, answers feel evasive or incomplete. This creates cognitive dissonance, a sense that something important is being withheld, even if no one openly lies. The most dangerous aspect of collective denial is how it delays response. Cities do not collapse when problems appear. They collapse when acknowledgement arrives too late. By the time dysfunction becomes undeniable, options narrow. Trust is already weakened. Systems are already brittle, and the cost of repair multiplies. Denial is not passive. It is an active force shaping decisions, narratives, and priorities. And as long as it holds, the gap between image and reality will continue to widen quietly, without warning signs dramatic enough to force immediate action. What these areas ultimately reveal is not just a problem with New York, but a warning about the future of modern cities built on myth rather than habitability. When a city's identity becomes more important than the lives unfolding inside it, decline does not announce itself with collapse. It arrives quietly, through friction, exhaustion, and normalization. New York is simply further along this path than most places are willing to admit. The dangerous illusion is believing that prestige protects a city from decay. Global attention, cultural power, and economic symbolism do not prevent breakdown. In some cases, they accelerate it. When a city must constantly perform greatness, it prioritizes appearance over repair. It invests in narratives instead of systems. The result is a place that looks successful from a distance, while becoming increasingly difficult to navigate up close. Visitors encounter this first. Not because they are targeted, but because they lack adaptation. They feel the strain immediately. Confusion in transit, tension in shared spaces, emotional distance in everyday interactions. These moments are not random. They are the surface symptoms of deeper structural stress that residents have learned to absorb over time. What feels shocking to a visitor has already been integrated into daily survival for those who stay. This is where the broader pattern becomes clear. Airports, stations, corridors, and transitional zones are not just weak points in New York. They are early indicators for other global cities following the same model. As density rises without proportional care, as cost of living outpaces stability, as denial replaces planning, these environments will multiply. What happens quietly in New York today will appear elsewhere tomorrow, often faster and with less resistance. The real threat is not danger in the dramatic sense. It is erosion of trust, clarity, and belonging. Cities rely on invisible agreements between people and systems. When those agreements break, people compensate individually. They rush, they withdraw, they stop expecting coherence. A city can function this way for a long time, but it cannot thrive. Eventually, the gap between promise and reality becomes too wide to ignore. New York still markets the dream, but the lived experience increasingly contradicts it. And once enough people sense that contradiction, the myth loses its stabilizing power. What remains is a city forced to confront what it has been postponing, whether it exists to be admired or to be lived in. If you stayed until the end, you already understand that this conversation is bigger than New York. Subscribe to the channel if you want more deep, honest analysis about cities, systems, and the realities we are taught to ignore. Leave a like to signal that this kind of content matters, especially when it challenges comfortable myths. And leave a comment writing, "I see the illusion now," so I know you made it all the way through. Now watch the next video appearing on your screen because this story does not end here.